Hey everybody, Pastor Tim here. Thanks for tuning in again as we continue our study in the book of James and also continue talking about this process of studying the Bible. So as we look back in James, I want us to just consider some of the themes we've talked about so far. We've talked about favoritism. We've talked about faith and deeds and how our faith should lead to good deeds. Last week, James talked about our words and that our words should be a sign of what's happening deep in our heart, that there's goodness and redemption that Christ has brought to us, and thus the words that come out of us are good. And James challenges us by saying, hey, I see a lot of darkness coming out of people's mouths. Let's see light instead. So this week we'll be in James chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. I want to continue to remind us about the process of studying the Bible and remind you again that the hope is we individually and then corporately as a church body will get to the place where we can just open up the scripture and study it together without a guidebook or tons of questions. And again, that's a process, so it's going to take a while to get there. But we want to open up the scriptures, and by going through these 5 steps, we can learn to study the Bible on its own. So again, to recap, those 5 steps are, number 1, let's look and see where is the book or the passage we're looking at. Where does that fit into the Bible timeline? Number 2, what's some background on the book? Who's the author? Why was it written? To whom was it written? What are the big themes that come up? And then those next 3 steps are observe, interpret, apply. Observe the text. What do we see as key ideas coming out? Who are the key characters, the key actions? Interpret it. What does it mean? How are we supposed to view that and then say, okay, here's what's actually going on? And then the last step is apply. Take those truths from thousands of years ago and then apply it to our lives today accurately. So we're in a very short text this week, again, 13 to 18 of chapter 3. But I want you to see here a little bit of the process where we can look at this text and then also consider other texts of the scripture. Now, to do that, I want to say one key thing. When we study a scripture in the Bible, we want to ask ourselves, what other references could the people who originally read this, what could they make? What references could they make in their minds? So this is the book of James. This is after the resurrection of Jesus and the ascension of Jesus. And so if I was a Jewish reader reading the book of James, reading the letter James wrote, I could reference the whole Old Testament. I could also reference the stories I've heard about the teachings of Jesus. I probably couldn't reference the writings of Paul because I wouldn't be really familiar with Paul at that point. I couldn't reference something that happened in the future, obviously. And so when we look at this passage in James, we talk about wisdom. Let's remember that these people could think back to the teachings of Jesus. They could think back to the books of Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, books that would remind us and get us to think about the topic of wisdom. So let's jump into this text today. And again, we're going to observe and interpret, and then you guys will have a chance to apply it in your small groups. Let me read the text. James 3, 13 to 18. Here's what it says. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such, quote, wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. All right, so that's the text, just those handful of verses. We see it starts off, it says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show their good life by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. So clearly wisdom is going to be a theme in this entire section and even just in those first 2 verses. Who is wise and understanding among you? James says, who's a person who's in your midst, who's wise and who understands? We might say somebody who gets it. And then he says, let them show it. So if you're wise and understanding, if you get it, you're going to show it by your good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. Here's a quick summary of that. Are you wise and understanding? I can tell if that's true when I see your good life and deeds done in humility. There's a connection between people who are truly wise and understanding and humble deeds. Right? James is making that connection for us. And so again, in your small group time, as you work toward application, you can think about how wisdom and understanding are connected to deeds of humility. He goes on and says, but, which is a word of contrast. Every time you see a therefore, you can say, okay, what's the therefore? Therefore. Therefore is a word that says, because of this, here's the result. But is also a word we should look for because but is a word of contrast. This is a concept, but here's something different. Sometimes the opposite, often a contrast between good and bad or light and darkness. So James says, but as opposed to this wise life that's living a wise person who's living a life of humble deeds. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, then don't boast about it or deny the truth. So James gives us a charge here. He says, if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, you shouldn't brag about it. Now, why would he say that? It's very likely that there are people who are bragging about those things, right? He wouldn't just say it randomly. So he's got some experience with people who have bitter envy, and selfish ambition in their hearts, and they're talking about it all the time. So again, when it comes to application for you and me, we're going to dig into that in small groups. Is there a way in which we can be like this? We can have envy and selfish ambition, and we can brag about it. We can talk to people. Selfish ambition, the idea that it's about me and it's about getting ahead. Sometimes we do that overtly, and sometimes we do it kind of subtly. But James is saying that's totally different. You shouldn't brag about that. That's totally different than a life of wisdom and humble deeds. Notice the contrast there again as we observe here, humble deeds and selfish ambition. Humble deeds of serving others versus selfish ambition, all about myself. Selfish ambition, that's hard to say. Selfish ambition, all about myself. James is giving us a contrast there. Continuing on, he says, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. And then he says, such, quote, wisdom does not come down from heaven. He describes it in a minute and says what it is, but realize that wisdom of people who are saying, hey, it's all about me, I'm going to live a life of selfish ambition, that is not wisdom at all. It's not from God. So think about that. Here's an interpretation we can see, that if a person lives a life that's defined by or showing the fruit of selfish ambition, that's not something that's flowing from heaven. And he tells us where it comes from. He said, for such wisdom doesn't come down from heaven, but, again, a word of contrast, it's earthly, unspiritual, demonic. Now, those words could be understood and say, okay, it's earthly and unspiritual and demonic. Or we can look at that and say those things are all just really connected. Earthly wisdom is about human wisdom and selfishness and mankind as opposed to God's perspective. We have earthly wisdom. We have unspiritual. We would say, what is good spiritual wisdom? Okay, well, that's not this. And then demonic as opposed to from God, from heaven. I mean, earthly wisdom is in stark contrast to godly wisdom. And remember, godly wisdom is about these humble deeds that we live out. I think that's really interesting because we can go to the place of saying, what does wisdom look like? It's somebody who's really smart, who understands the world. And what do they do with that? Well, they get things for themselves. They're very, quote unquote, successful in the world. Heavenly wisdom says, I'm going to serve others in humility. According to James, that's what heavenly wisdom looks like. He continues on and says, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, again, those two words, selfish ambition, pop up. There you find disorder and every evil practice. James very clearly says, if you have envy and selfish ambition, there's going to be chaos. So that's for us to think about again. Is James in the church hearing about or seeing selfishness, selfish ambition, and envy? Because he says what the result of that is chaos. It's disorder. So maybe that's an assessment process we can go through. Say, do we see disorder in places? And then go back and say, is that connected to selfishness and envy? Do you see the self-focus that James is trying to address here? Envy is about me wanting other people's stuff or their success. Selfish ambition is about me getting ahead. And James is giving us a strong contrast and saying, no, it's not about that. It's about these deeds of humility and caring for others. All right, continuing on here. He says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven, again, that's a contrast. So we've got all this unhealthy, earthly, demonic, unspiritual wisdom. And now in contrast, wisdom that comes from heaven. Well, what does that look like? It's pure. It's peace-loving. It's considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. There's a challenge for us right there. When we think about wisdom, what comes to mind? James is telling us this is what wisdom from heaven ultimately looks like. He says it's pure. It's not polluted with all kinds of other things like selfish ambition. He goes on to say, it's not just pure. It says then it's peace-loving. It's peaceful. Wisdom from God is filled with peace. It loves peace. It's considerate. It's not just about self. It's looking toward others. It's submissive, which means putting others ahead of yourself. It's full of mercy, not bringing judgment and pouring out justice and wrath, but being kind and merciful toward others. good fruit. It's impartial. It doesn't play favorites like he talked about before. And it's sincere. Sincerity, I love that word because it's in contrast with selfish ambition. Selfish ambition says, what do I do? What kind of angles do I need to take to get me ahead? Whereas sincerity is like, I'm just going to be totally honest and I'll let the chips fall where they may. James is showing us what that true wisdom looks like. Now, I want you to think here, as I talked about at the beginning, if I'm somebody reading this 2,000 years ago and I'm thinking about wisdom, maybe I'm going to go back to the book of Proverbs. I'm going to say, where's wisdom? What does wisdom look like according to the book of Proverbs? And so I go back there and I start reading it and delving into it. And so maybe on your own at some point, you can go to the book of Proverbs and just work through it. Proverbs is a great book to read over a month. There's about 30-ish chapters, and so you can go through the book of Proverbs in about a month, right? And so you go through it and you see this is what wisdom looks like and also what foolishness looks like. So if you're James's readers back in the day, you might go, wisdom, he's talking about heavenly wisdom. I'm going to go back to those books that taught us about wisdom, right? That's how we can tie our current text into other texts in the scripture. He closes out and says, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Okay, James says, this is what wisdom truly looks like. This is earthly, unspiritual, demonic wisdom. Here's heavenly wisdom. And then he ends by saying, if you are a peacemaker and you sow in peace, you're going to reap a harvest, and it's righteousness. I want you to notice here, it's a peacemaker, not just a peaceful person. I heard that years ago taught by a pastor. He said, peacemakers make peace, they don't just sit around in peace. And so a peacemaker is somebody who works towards peace. And he talks here about sowing in peace. That's an act of actually taking the seed and throwing it out there to be planted, right? So you're working toward peace. And if you're a peace-filled person who's sowing peace, you're going to reap a harvest of righteousness. Again, the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of man, or the wisdom of heaven versus the wisdom of earth. James is making a very clear contrast here. And so it's a challenge to us in our small group discussion time to say, what kind of wisdom do I like? What kind of wisdom do I pursue? And does my life show that I'm living a life of wisdom? Let me close here by connecting this back to this idea of faith and deeds, right? James is saying, if you have true faith, it leads to deeds. James also here says, if you have true heavenly wisdom, it leads to good things. If you have earthly wisdom, it leads to chaos and all kinds of darkness. So James is very much saying, here's the things of God, and they lead to goodness, the things of darkness, and they lead to so much trouble. So let's pursue the things of God. So there's James, the end of chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. Now head into small groups and have some discussion. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.